It was a rainy and dark night when Sarah arrived at S.O. Lucas Hospital for another night shift. As a nurse, she was used to dealing with emergencies and unpredictable situations, but tonight promised to be different. She had chosen to work the night shift to earn a little extra money, but she was about to discover that this decision would lead her into a nightmare that would defy logic and reason. S.O. Lucas Hospital was an old building with long, dark corridors and an aura of silence that seemed thicker on rainy nights like that. As Sarah made her initial rounds, checking vital signs, administering medications, and offering some comfort to patients, she began to feel a strange sensation, as if she were being watched. The patients were all peaceful in their rooms, some asleep, others fighting pain and illness. However, as Sarah progressed through the dark corridors, the feeling that something was not right only grew. The hospital was almost empty that night, with only a few patients admitted, which made the environment even more unsettling. Time seemed to drag by, and the rain hitting the windows and roof created a melancholic soundtrack. Sarah was about to make her last round before taking a brief break when she saw something that made her freeze in place. A shadowy figure quickly passed by at the end of the corridor, but when she turned her head to look, there was no one there. It must have been my imagination, she thought nervously. However, the feeling that she was being watched persisted. She quickened her pace and quickly checked the remaining patients before entering the staff break room. The break room was small and dimly lit. Sarah turned on the coffee maker and tried to calm her nerves with a cup of coffee. As the water began to boil, she heard a distant sound, like a soft, indistinct whisper. She raised her head and looked around, but she was alone in the room. "This is ridiculous," she said to herself out loud. "You're letting your imagination run wild." She finished her coffee and got up to go back to work. Upon leaving the break room, the feeling that something was wrong only intensified. The hallways seemed darker, the sounds were louder, and her footsteps seemed to echo strangely. As she made her rounds through the silent hallway, she began to notice shadows moving on the walls and soft footsteps echoing through the hallways. She looked around but didn't see anyone. Fear began to infiltrate her heart. When she arrived at the room of an elderly patient, Mr. Anderson, she found the bed empty, although she was certain she had left him there minutes before. The patient's identification bracelet was lying on the floor, as if someone had ripped it off with force. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine and ran for help. Sarah ran through the hospital hallways looking for help, her heart beating wildly. She found a doctor and 2 nurses and quickly explained what had happened to Mr. Anderson. They agreed to help her look for the missing patient and headed back to the room. When they reached Mr. Anderson's room, they found the bed empty and the window open, allowing the cold rain and night breeze to enter. The rain beat against the bedroom floor, creating an even gloomier scene. "That doesn't make sense," muttered the doctor, looking around with a perplexed expression. "How could he have gotten out of here? And why would he do that on a night like this?" The nurses began looking for clues, while Sarah approached the open window. She looked outside but saw no sign of Mr. Anderson. The wind blew the rain into the room, making everything even more uncomfortable. It was then that she noticed something strange outside the window. Bloody handprints were imprinted on the windowsill, as if someone had clung to it in desperation. She looked at the marks, horrified. "You need to see this," she told the others. The doctor and nurses approached the window and examined the bloody handprints with a shocked expression. It was as if someone had been dragged out of the room by force. "This is terrible," one of the nurses muttered. "We need to find Mr. Anderson as soon as possible." They decided to call hospital security and the police to help with the search. While waiting, Sarah and the other nurses began searching the hallways and adjacent rooms for clues. As they explored, they began to hear unexplained sounds. Shuffling footsteps resounded in the empty hallways, as if something was approaching them. The whispering voices they had heard in the stories began to echo in their ears, murmuring indistinct words. Fear began to spread among the group. They couldn't understand what was happening. The sounds were so real, but there was no one in sight. The lights in the hallways began to flicker intermittently, plunging everything into an unsettling darkness. "This can't be real," the doctor said, his voice shaking. "We're dealing with something supernatural here." Sarah nodded, feeling the pressure of fear in her chest. They continued to search for clues, but it was as if they were being watched by something unseen. something that was amused by their terror. Finally, the police arrived at the hospital, and the group reported everything they had experienced so far. The search for Mr. Anderson was underway, but what they were facing was not something they could easily explain. The macabre night was just beginning, and answers seemed further away than ever. The police, along with Sarah, the doctor and nurses, decided to split up to increase their chances of finding Mr. Anderson. Each group grabbed a flashlight and began searching the hospital's shadowy hallways. The tension in the air was almost palpable, and everyone was aware that something unusual and inexplicable was happening. As they searched, the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly. The lights flickered and flickered, casting ominous shadows on the walls. Every sound, every shadow made his nerves fray. Sarah was in a group that approached the hospital's pediatric ward. The sight of abandoned toys and empty rooms further worsened the gloomy atmosphere. She wondered if Mr. Anderson could have hidden there, but the idea that a child could be involved in that nightmare scared her even more. As they explored, they found bloody handprints on the walls and strange symbols scrawled on them. The marks looked like a trail of blood that led them deeper and deeper into the pediatric ward. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to the center of the mystery. Suddenly, a door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in that ominous hallway. The doctor tried to open the door, but it was stuck, as if someone or something was holding it back. Panic began to spread among the group, and they began banging on the door and shouting for help. It was then that a voice whispered in the hallway, a voice that didn't seem to belong to this world. It was an anguished wail, as if someone was suffering beyond death. The voice seemed closer by the second, as if it were getting closer to them. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and shone it down the hallway, looking for the source of the whispers. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw a shadowy figure approaching, a figure with no defined physical form, with lifeless eyes fixed on them. It was as if something from beyond was manifesting itself before them. The doctor tried to force the door once again, and this time it gave way, allowing the group to escape the cursed hallway. They ran through the hospital, frantically looking for an exit. The sounds and whispers chased them, as if the unseen presence was determined not to let them escape. Finally, they arrived at the hospital's main entrance, where they found the other search parties gathered. Everyone was pale and horrified, and no one could understand what was happening. As the group recovered from the supernatural encounter, the rain outside began to ease, and the first rays of sunlight began to appear on the horizon. The macabre night was finally coming to an end, but the questions and fear remained. The police continued to search for Mr. Anderson, but it became clear that they were facing something beyond their understanding. The hospital, which used to be a place of healing and care, had turned into an inexplicable nightmare. The invisible presence that had terrified them was still lurking, waiting for its next victim. The macabre night was far from over, and the mystery surrounding it was just beginning to unfold. The sun began to rise over the horizon, spreading a faint light across the interior of the hospital. Although dawn brought some comfort, the group was still deeply shaken by what they had experienced during that macabre night. The search for Mr. Anderson had turned into a terrifying and inexplicable experience. Police and hospital staff gathered at the main entrance, trying to understand what was happening. Reports of the unseen presence, the disturbing whispers, and the bloody handprints on the walls were hard to believe, but everyone present had experienced these inexplicable events. An experienced detective, Detective Ramirez, was assigned to lead the investigation. He listened carefully to the witnesses' accounts and examined the evidence, but it was clear that what they faced was something that defied logic and reason. As they discussed the next step, the doctor, nurse, and Sarah realized that something was missing. Mr. Anderson, the patient who had mysteriously disappeared, had still not been found. They felt an overwhelming responsibility towards the elderly patient and decided to continue the search on their own. They returned to the shadowy hallways, now bathed in the faint light of day. The atmosphere was different, but the feeling of being watched still hung over them. They revisited Mr. Anderson's room where it all began and examined every inch of the space. As they investigated, they found something they hadn't noticed before. On the wall behind Mr. Anderson's bed was a strange inscription, a set of symbols that appeared to have been carved with fingernails. It was as if the patient himself had made those symbols while he was trapped there. "What does that mean?" asked the doctor, looking at the symbols with concern. Sarah, despite her fear, felt that the symbols were the key to understanding what was happening. She photographed them with her cell phone and decided to research them later. As they continued to search for Mr. Anderson, they heard a distant sound, a sound that stopped them in their tracks. It was a soft, almost hypnotizing melody that echoed through the halls. It sounded like an old song, sad and chilling. They followed the melody, which took them to an abandoned room in the confines of the hospital. There, they found Mr. Anderson, but he was no longer alive. His body was contorted in an inexplicable manner, and his face displayed an expression of indescribable terror. Before they could react, the shadowy creature appeared before them, its lifeless eyes fixed on the intruders. The voice whispered in their minds, an anguished wail of someone who had been trapped in the hospital for years on end. "You freed him," the creature murmured in a sad, empty voice. "He was trapped here, and you freed him." The doctor, nurse, and Sarah couldn't understand what the creature was saying. Mr. Anderson was dead, and now they were facing a supernatural presence that seemed to be linked to the hospital in some way. The creature moved toward them, and the room grew darker and colder. Fear gripped their hearts, but they knew there was no escape. The creature was determined to protect the hospital's secret, and they had disturbed something that should not be disturbed. The last thing Sarah and the others saw before everything went dark was Mr. Anderson, the creature, and the strange symbols on the wall, all merged into one frightening vision. The macabre night had come to an end, but the hospital's mystery and invisible presence would continue to haunt the dark corridors for all eternity.